Hi. I'm happy to say that there have been many reviews in many countries of my book, Western Self-Contempt. But there has been one review that was not only negative, but that also attacked me personally. Now, I've been reliably informed that this review is continuing to harm sales of my book by dint of the fact that it was written by quite a well-known conservative, David P. Goldman. It was published in a usually serious publication, Law and Liberty. This is an outlet that I've enjoyed in the past, and I was surprised that they would publish a piece that doesn't just criticize the book, which in and of itself, of course, is fine, but that repeatedly ridicules my person, written by someone who has never met me. I link to the review below. I had previously published a video in which I responded to some common points of critique from several sources, and in fact, I had even posted a specific rebuttal to Goldman's review on my Twitter and Facebook last year, shortly after it came out. But since Goldman's review continues to be influential, and since it contains so many not just misunderstandings, but outright falsehoods, I feel obliged to answer it in a separate video and in greater detail. I take absolutely no pleasure in doing this, and I do it simply because my silence is being construed as acquiescence in the blatant nonsense that the review contains. Now, as I implied, the review includes a lot of ad hominem attacks and personal insults directed at me, and of course I'm not going to reply to any of those. They are designed to score cheap laughs among his regular readers, many of whom then of course felt egged on to continue insulting me without having read the book. Such comments and personal attacks are beneath the dignity of a serious book review, and also beneath the dignity of any reply to reviews. The first thing to point out is that Goldman has little philosophical training, as he practically admits himself, as we shall see, and yet he tries to review a book in the field of philosophy. As a non-philosopher, he has understood very little and ignored very much of what is a philosophical book. Since he has decided early on that I'm a contemptible person, this attitude, combined with philosophical ignorance, means that he misunderstands or misreads almost everything. Some of the review is quite rambling, so I can't reply to every remark, but as best I can, I'll reply to every substantive point. So, to begin, Goldman claims that I am putting forth a deterministic law of civilization and a cyclical view of history in the mold of Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee. But this ignores several elements in the book. First, I expressly criticize Marx and others for talking about historical laws, and I write that we should only speak of tendencies, pages 141 to 142, and that we should only look at how people actually behave through history while resisting the declaration that any historical law is at work. In fact, in a lengthy endnote, pages 229 to 230, I explain the difference between physical and logical necessity, and that because of this distinction, we must always strive to improve things rather than fatalistically surrender to any historical laws. But these discussions of mine apparently go beyond Goldman's philosophical horizon because he doesn't mention them. He claims that I offer a horrible example of the illogic of historical determinism, but if he genuinely wanted to criticize my view of historical movements, he would have had to discuss the passages in which I actually get into the philosophical nitty-gritty of that issue. But he does not do so. Second, I expressly criticize Spengler for being too totalitarian in the sense that he tries to cram everything in the world into his historical model. To the contrary, I maintain that we need a more modest view of history and that we only try to explain certain delimited phenomena, page 223 and again 141 to 142. A similar critique, by the way, albeit in milder form, could also be made against Toynbee, though I don't mention that in the book since Spengler is the more extreme example. And the third element that Goldman ignores here is that the entire epilogue of the book was written precisely in order to explain why, in spite of any historical tendencies, the force of our actions continues to be extremely important. But we'll get to more of the epilogue later on. It could also be pointed out, by the way, that the cyclical view of history has a far more ancient pedigree than Spengler. It goes back at least to Polybius and arguably even to Plato. Goldman then writes, qua philosophy, his book's main content is an expostulation against what he mistakenly represents as the Christian idea of free will and a defense of what he thinks is the Greek pagan submission to fate. This statement is indicative of Goldman's very limited philosophical horizon, because in fact, qua philosophy, the book is philosophical throughout and deals with a myriad of philosophical issues, and how they factor into oikophobia, but Goldman has not understood these, and so he simply doesn't deal with them. Much of the philosophical thrust of the book is actually about the historical and also philosophical intersections of relativism and positivism through oikophobia, which Goldman doesn't mention. As for his statement about my views on free will and fate, we'll get to that later because Goldman focuses on that later on in his review. The fact that Goldman then says that philosophically Beckeld agrees with the left shows how little of the philosophy he has understood, because to anyone who has read the book with any care, or who has read any of my other philosophical work for that matter, and who is philosophically informed, this is a preposterous statement. This carelessness in trying to understand what I'm actually writing is illustrated most blatantly in Goldman's next claim, because he says that even though it's true that I criticize the left for the vanity that leads to oikophobia, I reserve my most intense scorn for an attack on religion. Now, this is a most baffling statement, because in fact I do the exact opposite. Defenses of religion occur throughout the book, but it is especially chapter 4 that is reserved for a full defense of religion and for an attack on those who criticize religion, the so-called new atheists in particular, especially Richard Dawkins, who doesn't understand anything about religion. The most intense philosophical critique that I level at anyone in the book is leveled precisely at militant atheists, not at all at religion. And so I'm left to wonder, has Goldman not read the book that he's attacking? I doubt he'll ever see this video, but if he does, I would urge him to reread, or rather simply just read, chapter 4. Next, reacting against my claim that China, Russia, both very dangerous countries, and perhaps India will be powers to be reckoned with in the future, Goldman asks, if all civilizations decline, why are the world's two oldest civilizations, Chinese and Hindu, poised to supplant the United States? And why include Russia, the exemplar of a declining power with weak demographics? But this misrepresents how I use the term civilization in the book. I clearly use it not in this broad sense of a people or nation, but in the sense of societies. In this sense, a people such as the Chinese can go through several civilizations in its thousands-year history. For example, the Zhou dynasty is in this sense a different quote-unquote civilization than today's People's Republic of China, ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, even if one can point to certain similarities between them. Or if we take the Greeks, I do not consider modern Greece the same quote-unquote civilization as ancient Athens, a point at which a number of modern Greeks would probably disagree with me, but that's another story. I discuss ancient Greece and in particular classical Athens as a civilization, even though Greek quote-unquote civilization in Goldman's sense continued for a long time afterwards. So Goldman pays no attention to how I'm using specific terms, simply grafting his own meaning onto them, and then saying, unsurprisingly, that the end result is inconsistent. Goldman's failure to understand the content of particular terms is a point that we'll return to later on. It also has to be pointed out in this context that Goldman has not noticed the word Western in my book's title, even though it's written clearly on the cover, which is why his remarks about China and India don't apply. The reason oikophobia is a mainly Western phenomenon is that a measure of egalitarianism, a reasonably free intellectual space, democratic movements, and so on, are among its prerequisites. And these have been found more often and to a greater extent in the West than in the East. At the very least, there must be a sufficient amount of wealth for a relatively broad leisure class to arise, and there must be a space in which interest groups can debate and argue with one another, which will allow the splintering of society as some groups begin to attack their own civilization in an effort to get ahead of competing groups. If these elements are absent or only exist to very limited degrees, oikophobia cannot appear in any significant measure. I explain all of this in the book, especially on pages 58 to 59, but Goldman has evidently paid no attention to it since he thinks that China and India are counterexamples to my theory. Indeed, it is not impossible for a people such as the Chinese, which is far removed from the West and looking at us from the outside, as it were, to learn from our mistakes and to try to avoid them. In fact, on a more personal note, it's not a coincidence, I think, that my book is soon being published in Chinese, When I inquired of my publisher, Cornell University Press, why the Chinese would be interested in the book, it was suggested that they presumably want to learn more about the West, also in order to avoid our mistakes. Goldman has also ignored the fact that I say that a civilization can in fact rise again, and I explain briefly how this might come about on page 89. His critique that I mention Russia as a dangerous country to be reckoned with, which according to Goldman is silly since Russia is in decline, I think is easy to answer. I wrote most of this book in 2015 and 2016, and I'd say that recent events have confirmed the veracity of my words in this regard. It is Goldman's own prediction, made in the Asia Times, and again I put a link in the description below. It is Goldman's own prediction that Russia would not invade Ukraine that proved incorrect. Goldman next claims that I offer no evidence for the cyclical historical theory, even though, as I explain in the book, it's more helical than cyclical. Now, this is another very baffling comment, since anyone who has read the book with any care will know that chapters 1, 3, 5, 6, and 8 are all about that evidence. In those chapters, I painstakingly go through historical events and literary figures in order to demonstrate how the same types of things tend to happen repeatedly, that is, cyclically or helically, from civilization to civilization. This is normally what we would refer to as evidence. Goldman also attacks me for name-dropping, ignoring the fact that the names I discuss are precisely the evidence that he says I don't offer. You cannot say, on the one hand, that I shouldn't include so many names, and on the other hand, that I provide no evidence. The names, with the accompanying discussions, are precisely that evidence. In a work of philosophy and cultural anthropology that discusses large swaths of history, it is of course necessary to include lots of names. And if Goldman were actually objectively interested in trying to understand what I say, he would study my discussions of those names rather than simply dismiss them. Even though Goldman thinks I mention too many names, he faults me for not mentioning the prophet Jeremiah, or it seems for not discussing ancient Israel and the Jewish people. Once again, he has forgotten what is meant to be the scope of this book. Discussing those things would of course be perfectly legitimate, and as a Jew myself, and one with an intense love for the land of Israel as it happens, this is a topic that I find very interesting, and I was reading Jeremiah already as a little child. But in the book that I set out to write, I deal with the classical ancient world, that is ancient Greece and Rome, and then with Western Europe and the United States. And if one wants to understand a book, one should pay it the basic courtesy of trying to understand it on its own terms. But too often it happens that reviewers will attack a book simply because it's not the book that the reviewers themselves would have written. The most common and intellectually one-dimensional critique Goldman offers is this. Beckeld's indictment of Oikophobia bumps into an obvious problem. Any society that unthinkingly does exactly what it has done in the past will fail to adapt to changing circumstances and go to its ruin. To change social behavior requires a critique of the culture, but a cultural critique implies some degree of distance from the culture, the capacity to stand outside it and consider its failings. Okay, as I've had reason to say in the past, the biggest problem is that people read politically, not philosophically. Some non-philosophers, including Goldman, don't understand that I point at both positive and negative ways of understanding the same object, even though I write explicitly in the introduction that this is what I'm going to do. And indeed, I acknowledge the importance of self-critique repeatedly in the book. So many times, in fact, that I can't find all the page numbers, but see especially page 61. In fact, in this attack of his, Goldman almost quotes a passage from my book while trying to claim that I'm not aware of the issue. Because on page 18, I write, and self-analysis requires a distancing of the self from itself in order to view the object of study in its entirety, so that the people becomes more objective toward itself. But I also point out, which is my job as a philosopher, that a good and useful phenomenon such as self-critique can also have a sinister side, and has historically had so on many occasions. People demand that I should say that something is an unmitigated good or bad, but that is a view that politicians have when they try to run for office and want to woo voters. It is simplistic and not a philosophical view. Goldman attacks me for wanting to have it both ways, and, for once, he's right. But this is not a bad thing. A politician or a pundit either attacks or praises someone. But as a philosopher, I can, for example, praise and criticize Socrates at the same time, because different points of view and different philosophical contexts will yield different results. This is something that I discuss at length in the more general response video that I previously mentioned. Goldman next says, Socrates and Plato, writing in the aftermath of the defeat, had sound reasons to subject Athenian culture to withering criticism. To call this oikophobia seems churlish. It is impossible to think of critical statecraft without beginning with the Republic, the first and in some ways still the definitive examination of the foundations of the state. That is, Goldman thinks that I say that Plato is an oikophobe. In fact, however, I never make this claim. I say, on the very contrary, that Plato is a conservative who reacts against what he perceives the progressives are doing with his society, and who begins to dislike his own society for what it is becoming. That is almost exactly what Goldman says. I say explicitly that this is different from genuine oikophobia, and I offer other historical examples of this tendency, for example on pages 24, 29, and 53. And though I appreciate being lectured on the importance of Plato's Republic by Goldman, who I'm sure has many more PhDs in ancient Greek than I do, he has not noticed that I write approvingly of Plato's critique in the Republic on pages 127 and 235. By misunderstanding my view on Plato in this way, Goldman further attacks me for saying that Greek intellectuals produced oikophobia, since in the case of Plato, an intellectual, we're not dealing with oikophobia. But again, I do not say that Plato was an oikophobe. If Goldman had any interest in engaging with what I actually say, he would have discussed my statements about those Greek intellectuals who did produce oikophobia, or who took steps that later on contributed to oikophobia. For example, Euripides, Antiphon, Hippias, Alcidamas, Antisthenes, and Diogenes. But Goldman does not mention any of these, because he appears to have no interest in engaging in my actual arguments, or in the actual evidence that I offer. As I mentioned before, he attacks me for supposedly providing no evidence, but then completely ignores those names and those discussions that are the evidence. More parenthetically, when Goldman argues that, for example, Socrates' critique of Athens was justified, he again misses the point. He has not noticed that I write in the introduction, on page 12, although I generally position myself against oikophobia in its various manifestations, I do not primarily wish to condemn, but rather to understand it. As we shall see, it is quite easy to find some manifestations of oikophobia, as they appear throughout history, to be more defensible or morally legitimate than others. If one agrees from today's point of view that, for example, the Romans had an unfortunate tendency to be rapacious brutes, then one might look sympathetically upon those Romans who felt similarly. But since such judgments are so subjective, they are not really part of what interests me in this book. My point will finally not be whether particular instances of people turning against their own cultures are legitimate or not, but rather that such things happen in the nexus of specific socio-historical circumstances, that, indeed, there is a process, a development or transformation that takes place as the culture moves from being outward-looking and self-aggrandizing to being inward-looking and self-critical. Goldman next writes, too much of Beckeld's book is devoted to the author's internal dialogue about philosophy. This should not be surprising. I am a philosopher, and this is a philosophical book, published in the field of philosophy. If Goldman does not like philosophical dialogue, that's fine, but then why is he reviewing a philosophical book? Similarly, after quoting a statement of mine advocating the ontological bundle theory of the self, which comes from David Hume, as opposed to Platonist essentialism, and I'll get to that a little later, Goldman writes, I don't know whether this sort of thing passes muster at philosophy seminars, but it surely is not the conversation one wants to have on a first date. To which I would reply, first, Mr. Goldman, we're talking here about philosophy, not dating. And second, and again, if this is your knowledge level and attitude to philosophy, why are you reviewing a philosophical book? If Goldman had attended philosophy seminars, he would have known that while one, of course, does not have to agree with the bundle theory, it's a perfectly common and well-known theory in philosophical discourse. Basically, Goldman is making fun of me for discussing philosophy in a philosophy book. Goldman further writes about me, much as he wants to excoriate the philosophical oikophobes, he still wants to maintain his professional credibility in their ranks. This is a piece of personal calumny from someone who doesn't know me or my history and who has never met me. If he knew me, he would know that this is an outright lie, that in fact I have unabashedly brought academic dislike upon myself by publishing articles that severely criticize academic groupthink and bad academic methodologies. In fact, the book that Goldman supposedly read contains a bit of this as well, on pages 136 to 138. I am academically unemployed precisely because I have never cared about professional credibility. Goldman says what he does because even though I criticize Foucault a lot in the book, I still acknowledge that he is a more serious thinker than certain other French postmodernists, and that both the left and the right tend to exaggerate his virtues and vices, respectively. But to people like Goldman, the slightest hint of philosophical nuance and resistance to political partisanship apparently means that one is trying to be popular to the academic establishment. He would have had to say the same about Roger Scruton, who also expressed some appreciation for Foucault, more so than I have, in fact, and who, incidentally, endorsed my book. Scruton, like me, spent much of his life in academic exile, but I'm sure Goldman knows better. I would suggest that Goldman listen to a few podcasts in which I discuss this topic of rejecting academia, and even to my last video on this channel. I'll link to these below. Goldman next attacks my nominalism, a subject he knows very little about. He says that nominalism means that I must think that a crucifix in a jar of urine or a pig in formaldehyde has as much claim on beauty as the Mona Lisa, and there is no such thing as beauty, in his view, just random collections of things from which we derive a pleasant sensation. If there is no unity in perception, there can be no unity in the perceiver, and that I think that what we imagine to be ourself is no different than a name for an arbitrary collection of characteristics. Now, there is so much philosophical ignorance here that it is difficult to know where to begin, and I don't want to have to deliver a long lecture on different forms of nominalism and realism and essentialism. This video is already going to be long enough. But briefly, Goldman seems to think that nominalism necessarily entails moral and or aesthetic relativism. He has not at all understood the subtleties of nominalism, and that there are several different forms of it, as of realism. Again, I don't know why a non-philosopher is reviewing a philosophical book. Moderate nominalism, and in the book I do say that I'm a moderate, entails neither, contrary to what Goldman says, that there can be no criteria for judging beautiful objects, nor that objects gathered under a particular rubric are random, nor that the bundle theory of the self means that our characteristics are arbitrary. If Goldman wishes to make up for some of the philosophical education he lacks, he should read David Hume, A Treatise of Human Nature, Book 1, Part 4, Section 6, and Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations, Sections 66 to 71, on family resemblances, and take it from there. There is a vast literature on the subject. I say in the book that nominalism can be abused. I do not say, contrary to what Goldman believes, that to embrace nominalism today is capitulation to the postmodern camp. He has just made up that this is my view, presumably in order to tar me as a crypto-postmodernist or some such thing. In this context of essentialism, nominalism, and bundle theory, Goldman concludes, while he ridicules the notion of a distinct self, Beckeld nonetheless defends the concept of identity. He allows that the preservation of identity is useful in the face of both external and internal threats to a civilization. He thinks that Napoleon's grand tomb at Les Invalides is an obscenity because he doesn't like Napoleon, but opines that the French should still keep their identity and monuments as best they can, just as the Americans should keep Columbus Day and so forth. How it is possible to have an identity without having a self is a question that doesn't occur to him. Again, Goldman does not have sufficient philosophical education or interest to even attempt to understand how I'm using these words. Goldman is talking here about two different things: personal self and national identity. Furthermore, the fact that there is no essence of the self does not mean, again, that the bundle of characteristics a person does have does not communicate a coherent impression to other people over time of what that person is. And the same can be said of national identity. I cannot say that there is an essence of French identity, but this does not mean that there isn't a series of characteristics that over time one has come to associate with France. I am happy to explain these things, but what I find odd, to say the least, is that someone who is clearly not a philosopher would lecture a professional philosopher on philosophical subjects. Now, a professional doesn't always have to be right, of course, but I would have thought that a measure of intellectual humility would be appropriate when writing about someone's work in his area of expertise that is not one's own area of expertise. But I guess I'm old-fashioned. I come now to the final part of Goldman's review, in which he attacks my epilogue on free will. He attacks me for rejecting free will as merely a Christian invention, but this ignores my discussion of how Greek pagans laid the groundwork for it on pages 199 to 204. In fact, probably the most crucial figure I identify in the development of the idea of free will is Alexander of Aphrodisias, a pagan, but of course Goldman has nothing to say about this. Goldman also faults me for offering no real arguments against free will and for not discussing the pro and con arguments in the debates about free will, and Goldman there fails to understand, once more, that this was never my purpose and not my scope. Again, any reader who wishes to understand any book must approach that book on its own terms and try to understand what it is that the book is trying to do, and not reject it simply because it's not the book that the reader himself would have written. As I implied earlier, I did not write the epilogue in order to argue for or against free will, even though I make my position on the subject clear. Rather, I wrote the epilogue in order to explain that even with a rejection of free will, our actions do matter, contrary to what many leftists tend to believe, who seek to excuse people for their bad deeds based on adverse circumstances beyond their control. Goldman also lectures me that there is no necessary connection between Christianity and free will, and that many Christians over time have managed without that concept. It has escaped his cursory and very careless reading that I explicitly acknowledge this in the book, on page 205, and that I mentioned Tertullian, who by the way happens to be my favorite church father, Augustine, Calvin, and Luther as examples of figures that deviate or appear to deviate from free will. When Goldman then calls odd my assertion that the idea of free will is related to that of a just world, he has not understood that I'm making this argument in the context of theodicy and the afterlife, even though I discussed a precursor of this idea in Plato's Republic, pages 200 to 201. The idea is that in this context, the notion of free choice allows us to say that the cosmos includes retributive justice for our choices, as opposed to reward or punishment for people who did not freely choose. Goldman doesn't mention any of this because he clearly hasn't understood it. Apropos of name-dropping, Goldman shows that he's actually quite fond of it by then talking about important Jewish figures who have discussed free will, even though this has nothing to do with the point in my book. He concludes his review by ridiculing me personally one final time. I, for my part, will conclude by saying this. Actual professional philosophers who have read Western Self-Contempt have a very different attitude to this book. For instance, one of the anonymous peer reviewers who read the manuscript for Cornell University Press and who recommended publication may not have agreed with everything I wrote, but he understood the book in a way that Goldman clearly cannot. For example, in his anonymous peer review, he wrote that the book opens up a whole new area of study, words that I certainly appreciated. Goldman should listen to some of the podcasts and interviews I've done with real philosophers. He might learn something. Again, I link to a few of these down below. Why David P. Goldman hates me so much, I don't know. But I do know that this review was written in bad faith, stooping to cheap laughs and ridicule, trying to come up with a swashbuckling display to entertain his own cohort of readers, rather than genuinely trying to understand a philosophical work. His review also contains a number of typos, which suggest that it was written in haste and more as a product of anger than serious reflection. His bad faith means that once he has decided that he hates me, for whatever reason, nothing I say could ever be right or worthy of reflection in his eyes. I also know that whereas discourse and disagreement are good things, ad hominem attacks, personal insults, and blatant lies are unbecoming of a serious thinker. As for the editors at Law and Liberty, a review in which I am personally insulted and ridiculed does not conform to your self-proclaimed standard of serious debate, commentary, essays, book reviews. And to everyone else, thank you for watching and listening.